Chapter 11. In the meantime, Sir Ambrose Montague had been presented to the Queen, and the evening after his arrival in town he attended her drawing-room. The splendor of the English court at this period defies description. The walls of the room in which the Queen received her guest were literally one blaze of precious stones, and these, being disposed in the form of bouquets, wreaths, and trophies, were so contrived as to quiver with every movement. These magnificent walls were relieved by a colonnade of pillars of solid gold, around which were twined wreaths of jewels fixed also upon the elastic gold wires, so as to tremble in every instant. The throne of the Queen was formed of gold filigree, beautifully wrought, richly chased, and superbly ornamented, whilst behind it was an immense plate of looking-glass, stretching the whole length and height of the apartment, and giving the whole the effect of a fairy palace. The carpet spread upon the floor of this sumptuous saloon was so exactly an imitation of green moss, which exquisitely beautiful groups of flowers thrown carelessly upon it, that a heedless spectator might have been completely deceived by the delicacy of their shape and the richness of their coloring, and would have stooped to pick them up, supposing them to be real. The suite of rooms appropriated to dancing was equally splendid, and fitted up in the same manner, save the floors were painted to imitate the effect of the carpet, and rows of trees were placed on each side, hung with lamps. This imitative grove was so exquisitely managed that the spectator could scarcely believe it artificial, and the music for dancing proceeded from its leaves, or from an automaton birds placed carelessly among its branches. The dresses of the Queen and her attendants were worthy of the apartment they occupied. Brocaded silks, cloth of gold, embroidered velvets, gold and silver tissues, and gossamer nets made of the spider's web, were mingled with precious stones and superb plumes of feathers in a profusion quite beyond description. The most beautiful of the female habiliments, however, wore robes made of woven asbestos, which glittered in the brilliant light like molten silver. The ladies were all arrayed in loose trousers, over which hung drapery in graceful folds, and most of them carried on their heads streams of lighted gas forced through capillary tubes into plumes, fleur-de-lis, or any sort of form the wearer pleased, which, just a few, had an uncommonly chaste and elegant effect. The gentlemen were all clothed in the Spanish style, with slashed sleeves, short cloaks, and large hats, ornamented with immense plumes of ostrich feathers, it being considered in those days extremely vulgar to appear with the head uncovered. It would, perhaps, have been difficult to imagine more perfect models of male and female beauty than those which now adorn the court of Queen Claudia, where the beau ideal of the painter's fancy seemed realized, nay, surpassed by the living noble figures they collected. The women were particularly lovely, and as they stood gathered around their queen, or lightly treaded the masses of the graceful dance, dressed as above described, their brows bound with circlets of precious stones, and their glossy hair hanging in rich luxuriant ringlets upon their ivory shoulders, they looked like a group of Horace, or the nymphs of Circe, ready with sparkling eyes and witching voices to lure men to destruction. Claudia was very handsome, and though her countenance wanted expression, her noble figure and majestic being well qualified her to play the part of the queen amongst this bevy of beauties with becoming dignity. There is something in the habit of command, when it has been long enjoyed, that gives the imposing majesty to the manner, which the parvenu great strive in vain to imitate, and Claudia had this in perfection. The consciousness of beauty, power, and high birth swelled in her bosom, and even when she wished to be affable, she was only condescending. She now, however, received Sir Ambrose most graciously, She gave him her snowy hand to kiss, and addressed a few words of compliment to him, which sank deep into his heart. It is one to hear of the privileges of greatness, easily to excite emotions. One word of commendation from those above us far outweighs all the labored flattery of our inferiors. Thus the words of Claudia, and the warm praise she bestowed upon Edmund, gave the purest transport to his father's heart, and affected him so violently that he would have fallen at her feet, had he not been supported by a young man who stood near him. "You seem faint, sir," said the youth. "Will you permit me to lead you to a seat?" Thank you," cried Sir Ambrose, gratefully accepting the proffered aid, and leaning on his youthful supporter as they left the presence. The stranger carefully placed Sir Ambrose upon a sofa, under the harmonious trees we had already mentioned, and as he stood before him, asking if he should procure him some refreshments, Sir Ambrose had full leisure to survey his face and figure. Both were handsome in the extreme. The youth seemed scarcely to have passed the age of boyhood, and his well-proportioned form displayed all the lightness and activity of youth. But wit and good humor laughed in his bright blue eyes, whilst animated figures of the enchanting smile completed his ensemble, which few bosoms were frozen enough to resist. Sir Ambrose was irresistibly pleased, and longed to know to whom this fellow was indebted for such kindness. But he felt too delicate to ask the question in direct terms, and there was nothing in the youth's exterior to mark decidedly to what rank in life he might belong. He was handsomely dressed, and his air and manner appeared slightly foreign, though this might be fancy, arising from Sir Ambrose's ignorance of the manners and habits of the court. There also seemed something droll about him, and the air in which he submitted to Sir Ambrose's scrutiny was excessively comic. "Is there anything I can do for you?" asked he at length, when he thought the baronet's curiosity had had time to satisfy itself. "Nothing," replied Sir Ambrose, "But you would like to know who I am," said the stranger. "I own," returned Sir Ambrose, blushing, "I would fain to know whom I am so much obliged." "My name is Henry Seymour," replied the youth. "I was born in Spain, of English parents. I am an orphan and in want, and have been introduced to the Queen in hopes of getting a place at the court by one of Her Majesty's physicians, Dr. Coleman." "I'm quite ashamed," said Sir Ambrose, "that my indiscreet curiosity, that is, that you should have thought, I mean, that I should have asked for."
"In short," interrupted the youth, "you think perhaps that I meant to call you rude for giving such a long account of myself, but I always do so in similar cases. It saves trouble."
Sir Ambrose smiled. "You are a singular youth," he said. "I should like to know you better."
"I am," returned the stranger, "should be proud to obtain the friendship of Sir Ambrose Montague, and shall always reckon the day that introduced me to his notice as one of the happiest of my life."
The glow of pleasure spread over the animated features of the youth as he spoke, and Sir Ambrose fancied his accent sounded slightly Irish. Convinced, however, that he must be mistaken, he did not mark for it, but only exclaimed, "You know me, then?" Before the stranger had time to utter a reply, the Duke of Cornwall and the Princess Rosabella and Elvira approached, and prevented him from speaking. "How do you find yourself, my dear friend?" said the Duke. "They told us you were ill." "I should have been slightly so," returned Sir Ambrose, "and I believe I should have fainted, and paid my respects to the sovereign quite orientally, but this gentleman did not save me." "Well, I'm sure you are very much obliged to you, sir," said the Duke, returning to the youth.
"Indeed, we feel most grateful," said Elvira.
The stranger made a suitable reply, and after a short conversation, to which Dr. Coleman joined, the worthy gentleman having been also drawn to the spot by the report of Sir Ambrose's illness, he requested a favour of Elvira's hand for the dance. "That is a very nice young man," said the Duke, when he was gone to join the dancers. "I admire him much."
"He deserves everything you can say in his favour," returned Dr. Coleman.
I have known him a long time, and I love him as a son." When Elvira returned to her chamber that night, she sighed so often and so deeply that Emma, who assisted her toilet, could not avoid remarking her uneasiness. "Are you ill, my dear mistress?" said she, in a tone of feeling. "What else can have produced this sudden change?" "I am quite well," said Elvira, sighing. "Then why do you sigh and look so thoughtful?" "I was thinking of Lord Edmund." "Indeed, I did not think he had power to make you sigh. He has reason to feel flattered." "Oh, Emma, I wish you were like Henry Seymour." "And who is Henry Seymour?" asked Emma, smiling and beginning to suspect that she had rather hasty in fancying Lord Edmund, and occasion to flatter himself on account of the princess's tresses. "One of the most fascinating of human beings," returned Elvira. "So gay and yet so tender. He is not, perhaps, so regularly handsome as Edmund, but he has such expressive features, and his soul gives such animation to his countenance." "Poor Edmund," thought Emma, but she was too discreet to say so. Elvira was not aware of the interpretation that might be put on what she was saying, and she went on, ravaging in the pleasures of the ball, till she was fairly in bed. The following day was appointed for the triumphant entry of Lord Edmund, and the greatest part of the night preceding it was passed by Sir Ambrose in the greatest agitation. He could not sleep. He rose several times from his bed, in excessive anxiety, to listen to the repetition of noises which he fancied he heard. Once he opened his window, all was still. His room looked on to the garden of Mr. Montague, which, as we have already mentioned, shelved down to the Thames, and the calm moonlight swept peacefully upon the tall, thick trees and verdant lawn that spread before him. The evening breeze felt cool and refreshing, but Sir Ambrose sighed, and a strange fear of something he could not wholly define hung over him. He retired to bed, and at length sank into a feverish and uneasy doze. At daybreak, however, the thundering of a cannon announced the arrival of the important day. Sir Ambrose started from his pillow at the first discharge, and the solemn sound thrilled through every nerve and pealed along the sky. Scarcely had its echoes died upon the ear, when another and another peal succeeded, and the heart of Sir Ambrose throbbed in his bosom almost to suffocation as he sat, resting his head upon his hands, and striving, though ineffectually, to stop his ears from the solemn sound, which seemed to absorb his every faculty, and strike almost with the force of a blow upon his nerves. Whilst he was still in this position, Father Morris entered the room. "Come, come, Sir Ambrose," cried he, "are you not ready? The Queen has sent for us, and the procession is just ready to start off." Sir Ambrose started. He attempted to dress himself, but his trembling hands refused to perform their office, and Father Morris and Abelard were obliged to attire him, and lead him down to join his friend, the Duke, who was waiting for him impatiently. It has often been said that the anticipation of pleasure is always greater than the reality. This, however, was not the case at this present instant, as the brilliancy of Lord Edmund's triumph was far greater than even the imaginations of the spectators had before dared to conceive. The Duke and Sir Ambrose, attended by Father Morris, found the individuals who were to compose the procession of the Queen assembled in the extensive gardens belonging to the superb palace of Somerset House. The fine gardens, spreading their verdant groves along the banks of the river, adorned by all the charms of nature and art, and enriched by some of the finest specimens of sculpture in the world, were now crowded with all the beauty and rank of England, who, waiting for the arrival of their sovereign, formed an ensemble no other nation in the world could hope to imitate. On the center walk appeared the superb Arabian charger of the Queen, led by his grooms and magnificently caparisoned. His bridle was studded with precious stones, and the hoofs encased in gold, whilst the blue satin saddle and housings were richly embroidered and fringed with the same metal. The noble animal, whose flowing mane and tail swept the ground, paced proudly along, tossing his head on high and spurring the ground on which he trod, so conscious he could perform a conspicuous part in a grand pageant about to take place. All now was ready, but yet Queen Claudia did not appear.
"It is very strange, but lately it is always so," said Lord Maysworth to Lord Gustavus de Montfort, who had been for some time engaged in earnest conversation with Father Morris. Lord Gustavus stared at the sound of his friend's voice in some apparent confusion, whilst Father Morris replied in his usual soft, insinuating tones. "Perhaps her Majesty may be indisposed, and have slept rather longer than usual."
"Most likely," returned Lord Mayworth. "Yet it is strange the same thing should happen so often, if you remember," continued he, again addressing Lord Gustavus. "I made the same observation the morning of her last levee. Indeed, I have frequently made it lately, and I have observed that she looks pale and languid."
"Here she comes, at any rate, and for my part I think I never saw her look better," said Dr. Hardman, who had now joined them, and who, notwithstanding his violent politics, was one of the physicians of the court. The indolence of Claudia, which indeed seemed daily increasing, having induced her to overlook what another sovereign would have resented. Claudia did indeed look well, and her dress suited her well with her style of beauty. Her trousers and vest were of pale blue satin, whilst over her shoulders was thrown a long flowing drapery of asbestos silk, which, hanging in graceful folds, swept the ground as she walked along, shining like the sun, like a robe of woven silver. On her head she wore a splendid tiara of diamonds, and in her hand she bore the royal scepter, surmounted by a dove, and richly ornamented with precious stones. Thus gorgeously attired, surrounded by the ladies of her household, she issued forth from her palace, and whilst kneeling subjects bent in humble homage to her, she mounted her noble charger. Cannon were now fired in rapid succession, and the bells of every church rang in merry peals. The martial music mingled in the clamor. The palace gates were thrown open, and the procession poured from them along the streets, where crowds of human beings bustled to and fro, eager to catch a glimpse of this sumptuous spectacle. First advanced a long double line of monks, arrayed in sacerdotal pomp, and bearing immensely thick lighted tapers in their hands, chanting thanksgiving for the victory. They were followed by chorister boys, flinging incense from bridegroom, whilst beautiful girls, elegantly attired, walked on each side of the sovereign, scattering flowers in her path from the fancy baskets made of wrought gold. Behind the queen rode the ladies of her household and the principal nobles of her court. The superb plumes of ostrich feathers and the large Spanish hats of the latter, with their immense mustachios and open shirt collars, giving them the air of some Van Dyck's best pictures. As they rode slowly along, their noble Arabians paced proudly and champed the bits, impatient of restraint. The ladies of the court, superbly dressed in open letters, appeared next, borne upon the shoulders of men splendidly clad in rich liveries. Amongst these were Elvira and Isabella. These were followed by monks and boys as before, but singing a somewhat different strain. There was now a chant of glory and triumph that swelled upon the ear, for these preceded the Duke and Sir Ambrose, who, the one as uncle of the Queen, and the other as father of the expected hero, occupied the most honor. Two venerable old men sat hand in hand in a sumptuous car drawn by two Arabian horses, and were followed by a large body of the Queen's guards. The costliness and variety of the dresses worn this day were quite beyond description. Many of the ladies had turbans of woven glass, whilst others carried on their hats very pretty fountains made of glass dust, which, being thrown up in little jets by a small propellant motion wheel, sparkled in the sun like real water, and had very singular effect. In this manner the procession advanced towards Blackheath Square,
said to be the largest and finest in the world, where the meeting between the Queen and her general was appointed to take place. Amongst the numerous balloons that floated in the air, enjoying a magnificent spectacle, was one containing Father Murphy, who had been prevented, by a sprained ankle, of joining the procession, and the family of Mr. Montague, and nothing could be more enthusiastic than their delight, as they looked down upon the splendid scene below them. Few things, indeed, could be imagined finer than the sight of this gorgeous cortege, winding slowly along the magnificent street, supposed to be 5 miles long, leading to Blackfriars Bridge, through Greenwich, to Blackheath. Sumptuous rows of houses and other palaces lined the sides of the superb street, the terraces and balconies before which were crowded with persons of all ages, beautifully attired, and waving flags of different colors, richly embroidered and fringed with gold, whilst festoons of the choicest flowers hung from house to house. We have already said the air was thronged with balloons, and the crowd increased every moment. These aerial machines, loaded with spectators till they were in danger of breaking down, glittered in the sun, and presented every possible variety of shape and color. In fact, every balloon in London or the vicinity had been put into requisition, and enormous sums paid, in some cases merely for the privilege of hanging to the cords that attached to the cars, whilst the innumerable multitudes that thus loaded the air amused themselves by scattering flowers upon the heads of those who rode beneath. Besides the balloons, however, there were other variety of modes of conveyance fluttering in the sky. Some dandies bestrode aerial horses, inflated with flammable gas, whilst others floated upon wings, or gently glided along, reclining gracefully upon aerial sleighs, the last being contrived to cover a sufficient column of air for their support. As the procession approached the river, the scene became still more animated. Innumerable barges of every kind and description shot swiftly along or glided smoothly over the sparkling water. Some floated with the tide in large boat-like shoes, whilst others reclined on couch-shaped cars, formed of mother-of-pearl, were drawn forward by inflated figures representing the deities or monsters of the deep. When the Queen reached the spot near Greenwich, where, through a spacious opening in the river, and all its glorious majesty burst upon her, she paused, and commanded her trumpeters to advance and sound a flourish. They obeyed, and after a short pause were answered by those of Lord Edmund. The sound, mellowed by the distance, pealed along the water in dulcet harmony. Delighted with this response, which announced the arrival of Lord Edmund and his troops at the appointed place, the procession of the Queen was again set in motion, and in a short time arrived at Blackheath. The noble square in which the meeting was to take place was already thronged with soldiers. Almost every house that surrounded it was covered with spectators. No trees or fantastical ornaments spoiled the simple grandeur of this immense space. The houses that surrounded it, built in exact uniformity, each having been a peristyle supported by Corinthian pillars and a high decorated facade, looked like so many Atlantean temples. When the cortege of the Queen entered the square, the soldiers formed an opening to retrieve it, and reverently knelt on each side, with reversed arms, and bending banners as she passed. In the center was Lord Edmund, surrounded by his staff, all in polished armor, for since the invention had been discovered of rendering steel perfectly flexible, it had been generally used for war. Lord Edmund's helmet, however, was thrown off, and his fine countenance was displayed to the greatest advantage. He and his officers threw themselves from their war steeds and kneeled before the Queen. Claudia also descended from her charger, and as she stood in her glittering robes, surrounded on all sides by kneeling subjects, she looked indeed their sovereign. With becoming dignity, she addressed a few words of thanks and commendation to Lord Edmund as he knelt before her, his thick, dark, brown hair falling in clustered curls round his noble forehead. His graceful figure was shown to the utmost advantage by his closely fitting armor, over which, however, upon the present occasion, was thrown a short cloak of fine scarlet cloth, richly embroidered with gold, and fastened in front by a cord and superb tassel, made entirely of the same metal. He looked a living personification of the god of war. The queen raised him from the ground in a most gracious manner, and then turning to the still kneeling soldiers, made a short speech to them, of the same nature as that which she presented to Lord Edmund, after which, again mounted her palfrey, she made Lord Edmund ride by her side, and prepared to return to town. Edmund's quick eye had discovered, and exchanged looks of affection with his father and friends, though the etiquette of this present situation could not permit him to do more. And now he rode proudly by the side of the queen, gracefully bowing to the assembled crowd as he passed along, his heart beating with pleasure at the thought that his triumph was witnessed by those most dear to him, whilst his noble Arabian tossed his head and champed his bit as he pranced forward, as though he also knew the part he was performing in the splendid ceremony. Acclamations rent the sky with the proclamations advanced, and showers of roses were rained upon the queen and her general from the balloons above, from which also flags waved in graceful folds and flapped in the wind, as the balloons floated along the sky. Everyone seemed delighted with the grandeur of the splendid pageant, but no one experienced more pleasure than the occupiers of the balloon of Mr. Montague. Even that oblivious gentleman himself was moved to exclaim that he never was more enchanted in his life, whilst the raptures of his spouse were so excessive that, like the spectators of the stag hunt on the lake of Killarney, she was in imminent danger of throwing herself overboard in her ecstasy. And Clara clasped her hands together, and all the transports of childish delight, her sparkling eyes and animated looks bearing ample witness to her gratification. "What shouting? What a noise!" exclaimed Mr. Montague. "I declare it puts me in a mind of the acclamations in the time of Nero, when the Romans shouted in concert, and the birds fell from the skies with the noise."
"Papa, is that true?"
asked Clara. "Oh, it was a kind of strange question," said Father Murphy, "and one I couldn't like a child of mine to be putting." "And why not?" asked Mr. Montague, somewhat indignantly. "Because a child ought not always believe what her father says before he hears it open upon his mouth."
"Look how well the queen looks,"
observed Mrs. Montague, to whom the Reverend Father's remark was far from agreeable.
"It is said a short time since that she has lost her appetite and could get no rest. I don't think she could have much matter done with her now." "Nurse says she's being poisoned," cried Clara, "and that would be no great matter if she was, for then the people would have to choose a queen for themselves, and they might make the terms they please with her."
"And what kind of servant to suffer the attendant of Gradman, Miss Montague?" demanded the indignant father, roused from his usual lethargy by the importance of the occasion. "Clara shall go to boarding school tomorrow, and her nurse shall be dismissed. My child shall not be that utter treason."
"Dear me, Mr. Montague," replied the wife, "what a serious matter you make of a little harmless gossip."
"Gossip, do you call it?" repeated her husband. "It is such gossip as might cost me my head and you your fortune, if it were to reach unfriendly ears." An awkward pause followed his speech, which no one seemed inclined to break, till Clara exclaimed,
"Dear me, what a pretty horse my cousin Edmund rides!"
"I think that's prettier that comes after him," said Father Murphy.
"What? That one with his head hanging down and his mane sweeping the ground?"
asked Mrs. Montague. "Yes, and it's a very handsome man who rides it also, that walks by the side of him," replied Father Murphy. "His hands are chained as if he was a prisoner, and he looks like a foreigner," observed Mr. Montague, who had relapsed into one of his fits of abstraction. "I wonder what can bring him here."
"La, Mr. Montague, how you talk!" exclaimed his wife. "You know my nephew Lord Edmund has just gained a battle, and what can be more natural than he should have been taken prisoner?"
"True," rejoined Mr. Montague with the utmost naivete. "I never thought of that." "Ugh, it's a barbarous custom that putting chains about the hands of your prisoners," said Father Murphy. "And if it was not bad enough to be a prisoner without looking like one."
"Poor fellow,"
cried Clara.
I should like to go and let him loose. He looks very melancholy. How great my nephew Lord Edmund looks, continued Mrs. Montague. I declare it, a real king couldn't have the grander appearance. And then to see the poor old gentleman, his father, my brother-in-law, Sir Ambrose, sitting there hand in hand with the Duke of Cornwall himself. I declare it does my heart good to look at them.
Whilst Mrs. Montague was thus exulting in the reflected grandeur that shone upon her, from being sister-in-law to the person who sat hand in hand with the Duke, the joy and delight of that exalted personage had been almost as great as her own. His impatience during the whole procession from London had been excessive, and the moment he saw Edmund, he rubbed his hands in ecstasy, and jumped up from his seat to almost overturn Sir Ambrose, who was also bending eagerly gazing upon his son. "There he is!" cried the Duke. "Look how handsome he is! Oh, the young rogue! There'll be many a heart lost today, I warrant me. Look at him! Look how a colour comes into his cheeks as the Queen speaks to him! Look, now he helps her on her horse, and see now he's looking round for us. There, I caught his eye. See, Sir Ambrose, don't you see him? Surely you aren't crying, my old friend. Why do you make me as great a fool as yourself? God bless him! I'm sure I don't know anything we have to cry at, but we are two old simpletons." Father Morris, who had joined the procession of monks, was almost as much affected as his patron. Indeed, his affection for Edmund seemed the only human passion remaining in this aesthetic beast. Cold to frigidity in his exterior, Father Morris seemed to regard the scenes passing around him but as the moving figures of a magic lantern, which glittered for a moment in glowing colors, and then vanished into darkness, leaving no trace behind. Was he, unmoved as the wall over which the gaudy but shadowy pageant had passed, saw them alternately vanish and reappear without the slightest emotion being excited in his mind. Under this statue-like appearance, however, Father Morris concealed the passions as terrific as those which might be supposed to throb in the breast of a demon, even though he never commanded himself to relax for a moment. But when the interests of Edmund were in question. On the present occasion, however, joy swelled in his bosom almost to suffocation, and he raised his eyes to heaven, and wringing his hands together, exclaimed, "Oh, it is too much, too much!" There is something indescribably affecting in seeing strong emotion expressed by those who are generally calm and impassioned. And Sir Ambrose, by whom this burst of feeling from his confessor was quite unexpected, gazed at him with the utmost surprise, and strange to tell, though the monk had now lived nearly 20 years under his roof, it was the first time he had seen his head completely uncovered. Father Morris's cowl had now, however, fallen off entirely, and displayed the head of a man between 40 and 50 years, whose fine features bore the traces of what he had endured. His noble expressive brow seemed wrinkled more by care than age, and his sable locks had evidently become grizzled here and there prematurely. Sir Ambrose gazed upon him intently, for the particular emotion of his features seemed to recall some half-forgotten circumstance to his mind, dimly obscured, however, by the mists of time. The earnestness with which he consequently regarded the monk seemed at length to recall the latter to himself. He started, and whilst a deep crimson flushed his usually sallow countenance, he hastily resumed his cowl, and appeared again to the eyes of the spectators as the same cold, impassioned, abstract being as before. The ovation had now nearly reached Blackfriars Bridge, at the entrance to which the triumphal arch had been erected. The moment the Queen and her heroic general passed under it, a small figure of fame was contrived to descend from its emblazure, and hovering above the hero, to drop a laurel crown upon his head. Shouts and applause followed this well-executed device. The passengers in the balloons, wondering at the noise, all pressed forward in the same moment to ascertain the cause of such continued acclamations. The throng of balloons became thus very instant more dense. Some young city apprentices, having hired each pair of wings for the day, but not exactly knowing how to manage them, a dreadful tumult ensued, and the balloons became entangled with the winged heroes, and each ordered to inextricable confusion. The noise now became tremendous, the conductors of the balloons swearing at each other the most refined oaths, and the ladies screaming in concert. Several balloons were rent in the scuffle and fell with tremendous force upon the earth, while some cars were torn from their supporting ropes, and others roughly overset. Luckily, however, the whole of England at this time was so completely excavated that falling upon the surface of the earth was like tumbling upon a parchment of an immense drum, and consequently only a deep hollow sound was returned as cargo after cargo of the demolished balloons struck upon it. Some of them, indeed, rebounded several yards with the violence of the shock. Amongst those who fell from the greatest height, and of course rebounded the most violently, were the unfortunate individuals who composed the party of Mr. Montague, an unlucky apprentice having poked his right wing through the silk of the balloon in endeavoring to avoid the charge of an aerial horseman, who found his alone steed too difficult to manage in the confusion. The car containing our friends was in consequence precipitated to earth so rapidly as for the moment to deprive them of breath. "Oh, I'm killed entirely!" cried Father Murphy.
"Oh, my bonnet! My beautiful bonnet!"
sobbed Mrs. Montague, whilst Clara, dreadfully frightened, began to cry, and Mr. Montague, whose ideas were generally a long time travelling to his brain, particularly upon occasions of sudden alarm, stood completely silent, stupidly gazing about him as though he had not the least notion of what possibly could have happened. Indeed, it was not till a full hour afterwards that he found himself sufficiently recovered to exclaim, "Dear me, I do think we were nearly killed." In the meantime, and the confusion of the air still continued, piercing screams like demons were in the air, mingled horribly with the crashing of balloons, cries of the sufferers, and the successive fallings of heavy weights. The situation of the crowd below, however, was infinitely worse than that of those above. The momentum of the falling bodies being fearfully increased by the distance they had to ascend, those below had no chance to escape, and were inevitably crushed to death by their weight, whilst agonizing shrieks of the unfortunate wretches who saw their danger coming from a distance, yet were so jammed together in the crowd that they could not fly, rang shrilly upon the ear, and pierced through every heart. At this moment a dreadful scream ran through the crowd, and the horse of Queen Claudia, his bridle broken, his housings torn, and his nostrils distended, and his sides steaming with gore, rushed past. "Oh my God! The Queen! The Queen!" burst from every voice. One general took place towards the spot from whence the cry had proceeded. Beneath the triumphal arch, partially sheltered by its shade, lay the bleeding body of Claudia, supported by Edmund. By her side knelt Rosabella, who, assisted by Father Morris, was applying restoratives, whilst Henry Seymour was endeavoring to restore Elvira, who had fainted in the arms of her father and Sir Ambrose. His face, streaming with blood, stood a little distance amongst a group of courtiers, several of whom had also experienced severe injuries. The tumult in the air still continued, and groans and shrieks and exclamations that the atmosphere was supernaturally haunted were heard in many places, and some persons declared the accident to be the work of demons. A current of wind had blown those balloons that had become unmanageable across the city, while the others, terrified almost to madness, appeared still contending with some fearful monster in the sky. The courtiers, however, heeded not by the disturbance, for all their attention was occupied by the apparently expiring queen, whose long-drawn sighs and convulsed bosom seemed to threaten her most instant dissolution. "She's gone!" cried Lord Gustavus of Montfort, as her bosom heaved with a long, deep, heavy sigh, and then was still. "Yes, she's dead," replied Lord Doodle. "She is certainly dead," reiterated Lord Doodle. And then the sapient counsellors of the apparently departed queen shook their wise heads in sympathy. "Hush! She breathes!" cried Lord Edmund. For some moments the courtiers stood in breathless anxiety, watching the body, and fearing to move lest they should break the awful silence that prevailed, though their hearts throbbed until the palpitations were almost audible. Fearful was the pause that now ensued. All were suffering from the torments of hope and fear, and for all knew that the interest of the whole community hung upon her breath. Most of the courtiers also either hoped to gain places or feared to lose them, whilst all trembled at the uncertainty that seemed to rest upon their future destiny, and the prospect of the anarchy which the proposed mode of electing their future sovereign might create. The interest which the fate of the queen excited was thus intense, and the courtiers hung over her body with streaming eyes and motionless limbs to watch the result. At this instant, a fearful and tremendous yell ran through the air, and the car containing the mummy, which had been for some time entangled with the other balloons, fell to the ground with tremendous force, close to the expiring queen. The gigantic figure of Cheops started from it as it fell, his ghastly eyes glaring with unnatural luster upon the terrified courtiers who ran screaming in agony in all directions, forgetting everything but the horrid vision before them.